in keeping your scorecard. The devil's been busy in your backyard. Yes, he has, especially these past 4 years. Boy, it's really been something, hasn't it? Well, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronimus. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington. Tonight's show is dedicated to Sherry Hansen Steiger, who recently passed away at her home in Iowa. She was a partner to Brad Steiger, and Brad Steiger joined us 12 times on 21st Century Radio, and we seldom have a person on more than 5 times, 12, and a former public relations assistant to Dr. J. Allen Hynek. She is going to sincerely be missed. Tonight we are stepping to the edges of unexplained mysteries, and we examine 2 strange topics. First, the hollow and inner earth mysteries, and second, future prophecies channeled by UFO contactees. Our guest is my old friend, Timothy Green Beckley. Tim Beckley, or Mr. UFO, has been consumed by paranormal studies from the very early age. He was raised in a haunted house. He began having out-of-body experiences starting at age 6 and saw his first UFO at the age of 10. At 14, he purchased a mimeograph machine and made history and launched his known interplanetary news report. To date, he has more than, listen to this, 300 books and videos to his credit, and he's that he's written or co-written or produced, and he's written for dozens of magazines and tabloids. One of his sidelines is as a horror movie critic, publicist, and filmmaker, and among horror movie fans, he is known as Mr. Creepo. Today, he is the president. Now, there's a president for you. He's the president of the Inner Light Global Communications and editor of the Conspiracy Journal. He is co-host with Tim Schwartz of a weekly radio program on KCOR Radio called Exploring the Bizarre. I first met Tim Beckley back in the 1960s when we were both traveling the lecture circuit seeking the latest information on the unexplained. You know, in those days before easy access, it took a hell of a lot of work to get right information, let me tell you. Tim Beckley was at the forefront with his mimeograph machines and already had a lock on the mail order business, which was the only way to find most of these primary sources. He attended many of the gatherings of UFO contactees in the desert at Giant Rock. Oh, that must have been a lot of fun. And others, and scooped up and distributed their self-published pamphlets. And today, he's considered one of the best sources of first-hand information about the UFO movement of the 1950s. A few weeks ago, I was looking for a reference book on something completely different, and I knocked off the shelf one of Tim Beckley's 1990 books on the hollow and inner earth. I decided to call him up and bring him on 21st Century Radio to talk about it, of course. He informed me he has written several more recent books on the inner earth theories, and one of them will be the focus of our discussion tonight, and it's called Our Hollow Earth and Inner World Paradise, or A Gateway to Hell. The idea that there are hidden chambers or worlds under the earth is a universal tradition. Tales of cavern monsters, little people, and subterranean worlds have been around long before Jules Verne. But in the modern day, they have taken on new significance thanks to Richard Shaver's stories in science fiction magazines and something called The Lost Diary of Admiral Byrd, where the famed Arctic explorer claims to have met inhabitants of a lost race under the South Pole. Next hour, we'll switch to the other new book called Psychic and UFO Revelations for the 21st Century. First, let's welcome to 21st Century Radio, Brother Tim Beckley. How you doing, Tim?
All right. Nice to be speaking with you again. And I just want to say that it's very appropriate that you mentioned Sherry Hansen Steiger, because I did dedicate the Psychic and UFO Revelations book to her. In fact, we were working together on some material in the book about Edgar Casey. And we had been corresponding by, Facebook. And I know she hadn't been feeling too well on and off for years. She had had some problems. And of course, the passing of her husband, Brad, and my good friend, really upset her the most. I mean, they really were twin souled flames, if there is such a thing. And then all of a sudden, I was wondering, geez, I'm not getting any response to these messages that I'm sending her, and lo and behold, I found out that she had passed away. I think, well, it's just a little bit over a month ago now, and that's very, to me, it's very upsetting because I used to go out to Phoenix when they were living out there. We'd have conferences that I organized, and I usually spent my birthday at their house, or at least in Phoenix, And we were, I called her sister Sherry and brother Brad, and they in turn called me brother Tim. So we had a very tight relationship, and it just seems that a lot of our friends are transitioning over to the other side in the last couple of years.
Wow. Well, in the last, let's see, we tried to have Brad on, just before he died, as a matter of fact. Yeah, he was scheduled, and he died just before. And that would have been the 13th. Maybe that's not, there's bad luck for you, right? Of course. Now, you've been around the block a few times when it comes to the paranormal, but most ufologists are chasing UFOs from outer space. Why did you start going in the opposite direction to specialize in the inner Earth or hollow Earth mystery?
Well, I think I probably have to blame that on a gentleman who was one of my mentors. There were two individuals in the early days of ufology. Well, I had my first of three UFO sightings in 1957, and I began collecting, material on the subject. And in those days, if you were unhappy with something or wanted to get the media's attention, you would write a letter to the editor. So I was bombarding some of quite a few of the editors in and around my hometown in New Jersey about UFOs, and they had no idea that I was only 14 or 15 years old at the time, and they started publishing these letters of mine, and I was getting a correspondence from people locally, and being invited to be on some of the local radio stations. I think I made my first appearance on WERE, if the station even exists, in Trenton, New Jersey. And I was probably around 15 or 16 years old at the time. Now, my two mentors was Gray Barker, who was the head of a company called Caesarean Press. And he published three of my earliest books. And one of them was in 1967. And that was the precursor of the subterranean worlds inside Earth. It was called, I believe, The Shaver Mystery and the Inner Earth. Now, I had been, hooked on, I guess, this topic through the writings and publishing empire of a gentleman by the name of Raymond Palmer. Now, Ray Palmer was one of the original publishers of Fate magazine, which the first edition of which came out in 1948 and is still being published today by Phyllis Galdi. And Ray was a big proponent of the hollow Earth and the inner Earth mystery. He did not believe that UFOs were coming here from outer space. I mean, although it was a possibility, I don't think that he ruled it out because his magazine actually was called Flying Saucers from Other Worlds. So, I mean, he wasn't going to call it Flying Saucers from Inside the Earth, although, it's very interesting. I found out over the years, we've probably have published and kept in print about 12 or 14 books on the inner Earth, some of which would not be available otherwise. I found out that there was just as much, if not more, interest in the concept that the world was hollow and that there was a civilization below our feet than there was in the outer space mystery. Now, the concept that flying saucers were coming from other planets. Now, that theory, which we call the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, was popularized by a fellow by the name of Major Donald E. Kehoe. He ran an organization called NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which was had its board of directors, ex-members of the Air Force and the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, it was kind of top-heavy. Some people felt in disinformation, and they were not interested in unless it was a sighting made by a pilot or somebody in the Navy or a police officer or someone with a good credibility background. They poo-pooed the subject. They didn't want to hear anything about, UFOs encounters or humanoid beings, which was more in the line of the APRO, the Area Phenomena Research Organization. But Kehoe promoted the whole concept of UFOs being from outer space, even though there was no real proof of this that we can see. I mean, pilots were chased, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily come from the some other planet. And as we saw over the years, there is a big paranormal link to the phenomena. It's not certainly all nuts and bolts. These craft and the beings inside of them, if there are indeed beings inside, do not seem to operate on the same consciousness level that we do. So little by little, I think I was drawn away from the ETH theory, although, as you mentioned, my earliest mimeograph publication was called the Interplanetary News Service Report, but I guess I was just trying to get a few more subscribers. I wasn't going to change the name in the middle of publishing the magazine, although I did come out with a little publication called The Searchlight, which was more into the hollow earth concept. Anyway, so it was Raymond Palmer who kind of set me in that direction, because his magazine carried some of the stories of, well, first an example, there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Raymond Bernard, who was living here in New York. I believe he was teaching at one of the universities or colleges, and he went off to Brazil. I guess he had heard some of the legends and stories there about people living inside the vast caves that led to the inner earth. So he went off to Brazil and he started writing me letters. They were like on yellow pieces of onion skin. I don't know if most people know what onion skin is, but very, very thin pieces of paper. And if you struck it hard enough with the typewriter keys, it would punch a hole in it.
Yeah.
Right, because some of the letters that he sent were 7 or 8 pages long, and it described his meetings mainly in Brazil with the beings that lived inside the earth. Now, apparently, I don't know if he actually made it. Well, he did disappear mysteriously. After a point, he was never heard from again. But according to him, because of the inner earth people did not want to be harassed by the surface people, who they regarded as a very they regarded us as a very, very negative culture, right? So they had actual guards over the entrances to the inner earth that prevented people from wandering in. Although a couple of explorers who did disappear along the Amazon, it was believed that they did venture in or managed to make it in, but they were not allowed to return. So these were some incredible stories, but very interesting, certainly. And then Palmer also wrote about the Hollow Earth mystery, and we kind of have to separate the two, or at least I do. But the Hollow Earth mystery was the concept that there are openings mainly at the North and South Pole, that inside the Earth, which has a diameter about maybe 1,000 miles across, there is a central sun, and that there is numerous groups that live inside the planet, and there are entrances at both the North and the South Pole.
Now, with that, we need to pause to take our first break here on 21st Century Radio with our guest Timothy Green Beckley, or if you want to call him Mr. UFO, you can. And we're talking about Hollow Earth, an inner world paradise, or a gateway to hell. We'll get back to that when we return.
And now, from approximately coast to coast, you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. Oh, I'm Bob Elliott, one half of the Bob and Ray team from radio, stage, screen, and television. You must have heard of us. I hope you enjoy the show.
What a dear friend. Oh, God. First time I got a Christmas card from him, I cried. Oh, boy. Hey, you remember Bob and Ray?
I do, yeah.
Oh, they were so good. They were so good. Oh, well, by the way, friends, we're talking with Tim Beckley. By the way, you can find Tim Beckley on the YouTube by searching Mr. UFOs and Secret Files. And you can also tune in to his weekly radio program exploring the bizarre with Tim Swartz on Thursday evenings on KCOR Radio Online. Okay, now we were talking what we need to do is what is the difference between the terms inner Earth and hollow Earth?
Okay. Well, the hollow Earth concept, as I explained briefly, is the concept that the Earth is hollow. And now even back in 1938, Hitler had asked Admiral Richard E. Byrd, although I don't know if he was admiral at the time, to go to organize an expedition because Hitler believed that the Earth was hollow and that it could be entered through openings 14 that are supposedly like 1,400 miles across at both the North and the South Poles. And he believed that there was a race of Aryan beings who lived inside. Now, this concept is really not very new. It goes back hundreds of years. Most people think of the book by Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, which of course was made into several Hollywood movie versions, including one, I guess, back in the 50s that starred Pat Boone.
Oh.
And in the book, there was a scientist from Iceland, and again, this is presented as science fiction, but the Hollow Earth concept was a part of the culture actually at the time, and no doubt this was what stimulated Jules Verne. Anyway, there were three gentlemen, the scientist in question and two companions of his, that entered a cave in Iceland, and they went down and down and down. But in a little while, they came across things that prevented them from exiting the inside of the globe. They had, for example, there were volcanic eruptions. I think a couple of dinosaurs showed up and menaced them, and all kinds of trials and tribulations. So, in order to go up, they had to go down. And the book was immensely popular, and of course is still to this day. But the book was not the first, certainly, that was written on the subject. We found a manuscript. Well, that was written in 1864, the Jules Verne book. But we found a manuscript that was completed or published in 1741. Now, I'll give you the title of the book. This is longer. We're always accused of having very long titles, but this outdoes anything we would come up with. Niels Klim's Journey Under the Ground, being a narrative of his wonderful descent into the subterranean lands, together with an account of the sensible animals and trees. So I don't know how they managed to. I don't know how they managed to put that on the cover
Yeah,
of the book at
the
the
spine of
time.
the book. That
But
would. That's
well,
wonderful, though.
anyway, we reprinted that manuscript, which was rather difficult to find. There's some choppy versions on the internet, and it was originally published in Danish because the original author Ludwig Holberg was actually an eminent writer among the Danes in the 18th century. He was university educated and well traveled and wrote on many different subjects. Um, and he said, now apparently he was a believer in the paranormal and supernatural and so forth, and he accompanied his book, I guess, with the text on the back cover. He said, there are many people of both sexes in my country who believe in fairies and supernatural beings, and who are ready to swear that they have been controlled by spirits making them go to hills and mountain caves. You see, a lot of this strange phenomena happens around caves, and it includes narratives by miners and spelunkers and all. But the Hollow Earth concept for a couple of hundred years was very, very popular. There's an Edgar Rice Burroughs book that was published in 1914 called At the Earth's Core. There was later a book with his character Tarzan that dealt with the same subject. And even Edgar Allan Poe did a book. I don't know whether it was a book or a short story. It's called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Prime, P-Y-M. Does that ring a bell with you?
Not right now.
Oh, okay. Because Baltimore, but of course he was the Baltimore boy. So, and you being that. But
Kyle.
anyway, yeah, quite a number of books that dealt with the subject, and some of which I actually read. There was a book called Edda Dorfa, which was written, I think around 1860, which told about a fellow who was taken inside a cave in Kentucky. In fact, I think he was actually kidnapped, according to the story. He was a pharmacist, and he was a member of a secret society. Now, I don't know. I guess this was one of the reasons that they took him, because maybe they felt that he wouldn't. It was kind of. It's always been presented that the people that live inside the earth, or at least the more advanced beings, and I'm not talking about the ones that Shaver contacted, are leery about us knowing about their existence, because they're afraid that we're going to come and either try to take over and dominate their world, or to, if nothing else, to harass them. Also, there was another book that kind of impressed me, maybe even more so than Edda Dorfa. It was called The Smoky Gods, and it was about a Norwegian sailor and his father, who actually sailed into the hollow earth and stayed there for 2 years, living with a race of 15 foot tall giants.
Whoa.
And that was a very well written book. Edda Dorfa is a little bit more. You have to kind of study it more closely. In fact, Edda Dorfa spelled backwards is Aphrodite, and apparently since the author was a pharmacist, some people think that he might have been on drugs of some type, perhaps mushrooms, because in the cave where he ventured into, apparently there were giant mushrooms down there. So it's an interesting story, but I would point people more towards the smoky god is being a possibly a true version of a trip inside the earth. And of course, there are people in more modern times who have written about the subject and claim to have ventured there. You mentioned the secret diary of or lost diary of Admiral Byrd, which we published. Supposedly, he organized an expedition there and ventured either inside the hollow earth or as close as possible to it as he would be allowed to go.
That is quite some important story, and he went down there several times, right?
Well, it's very interesting about Admiral Byrd because on the if you just look at the story and you read the diary, you say that this is pretty darn incredible. I mean, supposedly the Germans after World War II, they took some of their best scientists and they set up a colony at in the Antarctic, and there was a Project Paperclip. I don't know if you've read on that, but
oh, for sure, boy, that's
okay. Well,
major.
Now Byrd had been granted a lot of money to form an expedition. There were, I don't know, many airplanes and ice cutters and about 1,200 men that were made part of this expedition. And he was supposed to be gone for about 6 months or so, mapping the area and exploring. Now, the South Pole was about the only place left on the planet that had not been adequately explored. And as you know, there has seemed to have been a race by many countries to go there for whatever purpose. In fact, Germany being one of them. And I think that at the current moment, there are something like 7 or 8 countries who have planted their flag in the Antarctic. So I don't know who everybody claims to own, I guess, a little piece of it. And it's always been kind of shrouded in mystery. But anyway, Admiral Byrd went on to organize this expedition, and he went out with his crew of 1,200 men. Now, he was supposed to be gone for 6 months, but he returned in like a month and a half or something. And he was very reticent to say what he had done while he was away. I mean, it was just like he had sworn his crew to secrecy. They had, I guess, to sign one of the first confidentiality documents, and most of them were members of a secret society that he had formed called the Loyal Legion. And they came back very, very early on out and refused to talk about much of what took place there. Now, he did grant an interview to a newspaper or a magazine somewhere in South America.
I think it was Chile. Was it Chile?
It was either Chile or Brazil, but you're probably right. It was Chile. And in this interview, he said that there were craft there that could travel across the face of the planet, from incredible speed, and let's say, the time of a half an hour or so. And this would be a great distance. And he also warned about these UFOs. I don't think he called them UFOs at the time, but he did discuss the subject. Didn't go into any great detail about it. And we've had people actually try to contact members of his family and ask whether this was true or not. And nobody will actually deny it. And there's, of course, another kind of great mystery that's involved with Admiral Byrd. He seemed to just, no matter what happened to him, he always seemed to wrap himself up into another mystery. In fact, we have a book called The Secret Exploits of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. And in this book, we bring forward, or one of our authors, Tim Cridland, actually out of Las Vegas, did a lot of research and found out that Byrd's cousin actually owned the Texas Depository Building where supposedly Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy from. And his cousin had was very influential in politics. He was best friends or cronies with John Connolly, who of course was in the motorcade at the time, and with Lyndon Johnson, and with a lot of the oil barons from Texas. But it's kind of strange that not only did he own the Texas Book Depository building, but after the shot was fired from there, or supposedly fired from there, if you believe in the one-man theory, he took the window sill from which the gun was fired, and he made a display out of it in his home, and surrounded it with assassination photographs and newspaper clippings and so forth.
What a horror!
I would not insinuate that Byrd's cousin had anything to do with it, but there have been some conspiracy theorists who have linked oil barons and Lyndon Johnson is being responsible or partly responsible for the assassination of the president. Very strange coincidence or synchronicity. Well, we don't believe in synchronicities or coincidences, do we?
Well, right now we need to take a break here on 21st Century Radio, and when we return, we'll find out more about subterranean worlds inside the Earth.
Hello there, this is George Martin, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. And I'm quite certain that there are many other places in the universe with greater intelligence than us, and of course they may be completely different life form.
Sir George, that is the only time you will hear Sir George Martin talk about UFOs. As a matter of fact, he unloaded with us 5 times on different aspects of the kind of esoteric stuff that we're talking about today. So that's the kind of guy he was. And our guest is also the same kind of guy. And his name is Tim Beckley. But now we were talking about what you may call the inner Earth. And that is also, what I wanted to mention was this. Our Hollow Earth, an inner world paradise or a gateway to hell. I like that title very much. Light Global Communications. As a matter of fact, Psychic and UFO Revelations for the 21st Century Radio, we're going to be talking about that next hour. Okay. So we want to finish up on Byrd, and then let's find out what's inside.
One more very short Byrd story. Okay, Admiral Byrd had a brother. I believe the brother was in the Navy as well, but I'm a little unclear on that at the moment. Anyway, the brother had a very strange demise, as I understand it. He was living in Boston, and he was supposed to, I think, travel down to Washington, D.C. to meet his brother or a member of the family. Okay, he supposedly got on the train at a certain time, and I would believe the trip would probably be about 6 or 7 hours from Boston to D.C. He never arrived. Well, they looked for him for several days, and his body was found inside a warehouse, I believe it was. And he was totally disheveled and dressed completely different than when he had headed out to see the members of his family. So it just seems that strange things have followed Byrd around and after the time of Project Paperclip. And we have often received warnings, which we can go into in the next part of the program, to stay away from getting too close to the hollow or inner Earth, and certainly about presenting this information to the public. It's known as the greatest or one of the greatest secrets of all time. It's something that people just do not want to discuss. You kind of think of it as kind of being a fringe thing, but as you can see by this discussion, it has not always been that way. In fact, John Quincy Adams, who was president of the United States back before you and I were born, Dr. Bob,
Yeah,
was a believer in the hollow earth concept, and he tried to get Congress to fund an expedition there, but most of, I guess, the members of Congress poo-pooed the idea, and the expedition never took place. But I guess you could call John Quincy Adams the hollow earth president.
but where are the entrances?
Where are the entrances? You mean besides the North and the South Pole, which neither you nor I will get to. In fact, somebody wrote me recently, and they said they wanted to form an expedition to go to the entrance at the South Pole. Well, a couple of people have tried that. Just to rent the necessary like ice cutter to get there, I think you have to rent it from the Russians, who probably have a commercial deal, but it costs like millions of dollars. I don't think anybody on our mailing list, I don't know about yours, but anybody on our mailing list has that kind of money to fund it. Where are the other entrances? Okay, we talked about some of them in Brazil and in South America. Here in the United States now, uncannily enough, there's even supposed to be one in Manhattan, right here in New York City, maybe within a block or two from where I am now broadcasting from. According to the late talk show host Long John Nebel, who was the originator of the all-night talk show. I mean, he was doing this back in the 1950s. He was an auctioneer, and he was discovered by, I guess, the president or vice president of WOR, and they gave him his own show. Bob, he was on 5.5 hours a night. Can you imagine that?
Well, actually, when our first show was,
Yes.
we did that 5.5 hours, and it's a killer.
It's a killer. It's a killer. But I have to say, in the middle of the program, we got a half an hour break, and Sarge's Deli brought in some of the greatest pastrami sandwiches going. And I was on the show a few times, but I was more friendly with his fourth wife, Candy Jones, who I guess is best known for being a MK Ultra person, a mind control person who is being used by the CIA. In fact, in one of our conspiracy books, we discuss the plight of Candy Jones. She was a well-known model. Anyway, Long John used to thrive on this kind of information. There was a fellow by the name of John J. Robinson who lived over in Jersey City, which is a scant few miles on the PATH train from here. Now, John J. Robinson is the fellow that I took the famous photograph of the only one that we know of the man in black standing in front of the doorway to his apartment building back in 1965. And this has been published all over the world, and I've been on UFO Hunters to talk about it. But the reason perhaps now, John Robinson was involved in investigating some UFO cases. There had been a UFO landing right there in near Jersey City. But he was very much involved with the Shaver mystery and the Inner Earth. In fact, he was on the Long John show quite a number of times. Now, he was a Buddhist, and he talked about how the Buddhist religion believes in the existence of a underground civilization known as Agartha.
Yeah.
And we've also heard about Shangri-La, which apparently existed up in Tibet, and people, the monks would enter there and visit with the friendly people that lived inside the earth. Anyway, Jack talked about some of the entrances, placing most of them in Arizona and in the Southwest. Now, there have been a number of individuals that I have even corresponded with who had a lot of strange things happen to them around the Superstition Mountains. I would say be very, very careful if you're going out there. not only will the heat of the Arizona sun dry you up real fast, but it's known to be, the area around the Superstition Mountains is known to be plagued with disappearing people, UFO abductions, and people who have died under mysterious circumstances. People who went out to look for the lost Dutchman mine, and they fell from the side of the mountain cliffs, or they were shot by unknown parties. Apparently, there is an entrance there, but which may even contain a vast wealth of some type, but people are prevented from entering there. Also, Long John used to talk about an entranceway in Manhattan here. He claimed that in one of the buildings, now we heard it was the Empire State Building, but I don't know as if that's a fact or not. You could enter a building, particular building. You would get into a particular elevator and push the basement button. And when it went down to the basement, you would push it a certain number of times, maybe 2 times, and then give it a second or 2 rest, and then push it another 2 times. And the elevator car would move sideways and go down even further. And it would go down to the lair of the Diro. Now, we haven't really talked about the Diro yet this evening, but Richard Shaver was the mastermind behind the concept that there was a race of mutated beings who lived inside the earth. Now, not in the hollow earth, but they lived in the caverns. And what had happened, according to Shaver, was back, let's say, hundreds of thousands of years ago. The earth was populated by an advanced society. And at that time, there was actually a canopy that existed over the planet, which is described in the Bible, and there's a chapter about it in the Subterranean Worlds and the Inner Earth by Theodore Fitch, who is now deceased, a Bible student who knew every passage of the Bible and came up with a number of passages which talk about this canopy. Anyway, this canopy protected the planet from the radio activity of the sun, and supposedly people that were living here at that time lived to be several hundred years old, 200 years old, 400 years old, just as described in the Bible. But there was some disaster, perhaps maybe a comet or an asteroid hitting the planet, and it broke up this canopy. And it destroyed all the dinosaurs that were living on the planet. Apparently, the dinosaurs existed at the same time these advanced beings were living here. Anyway, the advanced being, they were called the elders, or at least Richard Shaver called them the elders, bored into the ground, under the ground several miles. Now, apparently there was already a tunnel system there, but they also built their own cities, vast cities underground, some of which miners and prospectors have accidentally run into. They built these large cities and inhabited them for many, many centuries, until it got to the point where the radioactivity, I guess, from the sun, because the canopy was missing, was starting to get into the earth as well. And many of the people living there were turning into a race of almost demonic-like beings, which Shaver called Diro. Now, this is the concept of hell inside the earth. Shaver claims that the concept of a religious hell is really taking place right below our feet. Anyway, the master race, the elders, took many of their people and left the planet and went to some far off system in space, and they do return from time to time. Some of them are the good guys. Maybe this is members of the Ashtar Command, as we call them, or the Confederation of Planet. But some of them are coming back to rob the riches from the planet and are in touch with these demonic beings known as the Diro, who live below the surface of the planet in these cities, which they took over when the elders left eons ago.
Well, we got about 30 seconds left here now, but I wanted to let our listeners know once again, we're listening to Timothy Green Beckley, and when we move into our next hour, we're going to go into his book, Psychic and UFO Revelations for the 21st Century. Freak weather, earth changes, pole shifts, aliens arrive, global conflict, epidemics, etc. Thank you very much, Tim. We'll be seeing you in just about 8 minutes.